and now. Let's talk about the implications for society in this country as mentioned. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Baroness Claire Fox of Buckley. She's the director of the Academy of Ideas and sits in the House of Lords. Welcome to you, Claire.
It's great to be on the show.
It's great to have you, and thank you very much for sparing time at this holiday time as well. Now, you are someone who is deeply troubled by the hundreds of thousands of people who've taken to the streets, not just in London, but across the country, of the pro-Palestinian marches. You worry about why people are doing it and the message that's going out from there.
Yeah, we should clarify that you couldn't watch the scenes of civilians being killed in Gaza and not have some moral dilemmas about the issues at stake, whether this is too much warfare or whether the Israelis are behaving in a way that's appropriate and so on. And if it were that, in this instance, that people were genuinely simply moved by those scenes, then you might think, why am I on the radio talking about it? Just maybe a difference of opinion. But I think that what's much more troubling is that, for example, I think it was today or yesterday, there's been a big demonstration outside Zara, the shop, on the basis that somehow Zara has somebody who works for them, their chief designer, who has basically sided with Israel and not been sympathetic to some of the Hamas arguments, and they've made a big fuss about it. And this should ring alarm bells, because it's not just been here, it's been Starbucks, it's been Marks and Spencer's. You think that anyone with a kind of slight inkling of history might go, targeting shops that are associated with Jews, when did that happen before?
Yes.
I think that we can seriously say that one of the troubling bits for me since October the 7th has not just been this horrible war that has unfolded, but the growth of anti-Semitism, or the explicit expression of anti-Semitism on the streets of Western countries, on university campuses, and people just casually and cavalierly thinking this doesn't matter. Well, it matters a huge amount. It's utterly destructive socially, and it does indicate that we have a real generational problem, I think.
Claire, it seems to me that the term progressive seems the more progressive you are, the more you are inclined to mob rule. We are seeing mobs turn up, not just in their tens, but in their hundreds of thousands, to beat down a silent majority in this country. How do we fix this, particularly if this is coming, as you say, from people who are under 35? Well,
first of all, I suppose I have to clarify. I mean, I come from what was the progressive left in some ways.
But it's deviated. There's sort of two sets of progressives, aren't there now?
But that's why I think we need to be clear, because I think one of the things that's happened is that for those of us who for many years were interested in supporting Palestinian self-determination, we might well associate that with liberation movements of the past, all sorts of things. What we've got to recognise is that for some time now, that is of the past. Hamas actually slaughtered and silenced any kind of progressive solution in the Middle East, in Gaza, many years ago, and continues to do so. So I think one of the things that's happened is that you get a confusion, because when I talk to young people about what they're supporting in relation to what they see as Gazan resistance, the problem is that they're imagining this as some sort of like romantic, fight back against the oppressor. They've all been reared on a political idea that this is that we have a kind of dominant state like Israel is bound to be representative of white supremacy, of colonialism, and so on and so forth, and they want to be associated with the progressive anti-colonial victim side. Well, first of all, this is just not historically accurate at all. And were they to read back a little further, they might notice that actually Israel emerged, it had to fight its own colonial struggle for Israel to exist in the first place, against Britain, as it happens. But there's a kind of overly simplistic, moralistic view. And I think, therefore, you've got, once you reduce everything to a real black and white moralism in that way, with no dilemmas, no historical nuance, very little reading. I mean, just to say, I'm only plugging this because I'm enjoying it. I'm reading this book, Mandate, by Leslie Thunberg, about the Palestine 1919 to 1939.
Yes.
You don't read enough. You need to know more. You need to constantly challenge yourself. I've just read an article on Heard, which I didn't agree with. It was an interview on this issue, but it was important to read something I didn't agree with. But when you talk to people, it's literally Israelis, the Jewish state are evil and the bad guys. Nobody talks about October the 7th. That's like, oh, that was just one day. This is many, many days. They don't recognize that this was a Jewish pogrom in a way that we should historically reflect what that means. And then the open anti-Semitism in this country means that what you described as the mob rule, it's like a hysteria. You know, people are actually behaving well. We have got to stop this happening. And it's almost like they would do anything to stop it. And that's why I think we're seeing such emotionalism on the demonstrations. And the final thing I'd say is there are people who may be a bit nervous. You know, they're kind of walking alongside people who are shouting, you know, anti-Semitic slogans or members of Hizb ut-Tahrir or what have you. And it's not that they don't feel queasy, but they don't do anything about it. So you've got left-wingers who apparently, you know, politically, or not even left-wingers, people, mainstream people involved in politics, don't think of themselves as anti-Semitic at all, but they turn a blind eye to it. They look away. Now, we live in an era where you only have to say the wrong word and you can be accused of a microaggression and racism on a university campus. But somehow, when it comes to slandering or slurring Jewish people, that's something we all have to kind of, well, you can understand it. They're suffering hard in Gaza, and that's why people are so furious. And that kind of apologism is very dangerous.
Claire, are we sleepwalking into another era of beyond the post-war settlement? We lived, I think, from 1945, perhaps up to the start of the Corbyn era in the Labour Party, in a settlement which was created by the Allies, by Churchill and Roosevelt, etc. But are we sleepwalking into another multipolar era where the American-led view of the world as the world's policeman has been superseded by the dictatorships of Iran, Russia and China?
Well, I think ever since the end of the Cold War, there's been a difficulty for that view of the world. You know, America allegedly representing the free world versus the unfree world of the Soviet Union and its bloc and Eastern Europe and so on. And the collapse of the Cold War and the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which, by the way, we should all be delighted happened, but it didn't mean that you had, therefore, a straightforward set of arrangements internationally. But I think you can see that, by the way, when you look at the United Nations attitude in relation to Israel. United Nations is one of those post-war institutions, like NATO, like these arrangements that you say. Look at the United Nations now. Its behaviour in relation to Israel is to treat it as a pariah state, an exceptional state. It behaves as though Israel's actions, and I don't just mean in the recent Gaza war, but consistently, they have basically identified Israel as a problematic state, and almost obsessively. And I think the behaviour of United Nations agencies in relation to, for example, the explicitly filmed rapes and sexual degradation of women on October the 7th, where the UN Women's Organization looked the other way, would indicate that a lot of these organizations and institutions are not fit for purpose. And so it's not that I think you should just go along with everything America has ever said as the policeman, or I don't know whether I should say police person.
Yes. You caught me there being politically incorrect again, Claire.
Or foul or something. But anyway, I would be heavily critical of a lot of American actions over the years, not least Iraq, but, more recently, but, there's a lot more of them, Vietnam and so on and so forth, since that post-war settlement. But that's not really what's going on here. I think what's happening is, as America's losing control, it's more of a domestic issue, because if you think about it, the problem is not so much what Hamas is doing. What I'm saying is the citizens of Western countries are actually so loathe the West. They've been reared on this really negative and nihilistic view that everything associated with the West, Western civilization, back to, ancient Greek Athenian democracy through to the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, the modern industrial era, they're told was disastrous and awful. There's a kind of self-loathing there that then takes the form of always supporting those victims who say that the West are oppressing them. And that is, in a way, what's happened. I don't think this is to honour the people of Gaza the way that Western progressives are their supporters, because they see them as a kind of universal victim without any agency, completely condescendingly. We support you regardless, and we hate anyone who is fighting back, you know, Israel in a self-defense mode post 7th of October, regardless of what you think about how far the war has gone now. To see things in those simplistic terms is disastrous for this new world order that's emerging, because it means that the West's own citizens are completely alienated and at odds from the nation states and the national traditions of the countries they live in. Sometimes people are too keen to blame that on immigrants who are here and they don't understand our ways. I mean, you go on any university campus, you'll find that very often these are absolutely British students who are as sucked up into all of this nihilistic atmosphere about Western views as anyone else.
Claire, in this country, we had an arm of political resistance on the Labour side under Jeremy Corbyn, which, if it had existed 5 years later at this time of war in the Middle East, would have caused unprecedented tensions. To the credit of Sir Keir Starmer, even though he may not have entirely cured the problem of the left, the Labour Party animal is a different one during the Corbyn years than to the one now. They are 15 to 20 points ahead of what looks like a hapless Conservative Party in the dying embers of its government, or is it? We still have to wait for that election to come. But these have real effects on the ballot box. So if it is a Labour government next year, and as Sir Keir Starmer keeps on saying, I'm laser focused on getting into power, I will say anything to get into power, this will have an impact. The Palestinian protests will have an impact on British foreign policy should Labour beat the Conservatives and get into power this time next year.
I think that's very true, although I have to say that I was very... I noted that David Cameron, Lord Cameron, we have to call him now.
Yes.
Lord Cameron.
He's your mate now. He sits with you.
I don't think that mate will ever be like this. But anyway, he's actually come out with I mean, his position on the war has been ambivalent, I think, since he actually came into that new role. It's been much more of a fudge. And I think that I wouldn't, if I was Israel, I wouldn't rely on the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom myself. Anyway, that's one side. Your question is on the Labour Party. And I have to give credit to Keir Starmer because he's been under an enormous amount of pressure. He and people like Wes Streeting been under an enormous amount of pressure internally within their own party to, as it were, go along with the call for ceasefire. And by the way, you know, it sounds like you have to be a lunatic to not want a ceasefire. I mean, who doesn't want to end a war? You know, I'm a peacenik type. I'm an anti-militarist. But of course, in the context that we're talking, the ceasefire is only aimed at Israel. It's never, the pressure is never on Hamas to return the hostages. And it would effectively be, in many ways, Israel giving up on trying to eradicate the threat that it faced on October the 7th, and which Hamas have stated will happen again and again and again until the Jewish state is destroyed, and so on and so forth, and the caliphate set up and so on. So I think that Keir Starmer's done really well. But what I'm worried about is that the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, certainly anti-Semitism was allowed to grow, but the majority of Labour Party members, indeed voters, were not anti-Semitic, but they were indifferent to the rise of anti-Semitism. Again, it's one of those things where you kind of look the other way. You don't notice it. It's not the kind of racist. In fact, you don't really think, you know, it's racism to be anti-Israel. I mean, no, you know, you can't be racist about Jewish people because aren't they all white? You know, there's kind of prejudices that run all the time now. And they were indifferent to that. I think Keir Starmer's got a real problem if he wins the election, which seems likely. Not that he's not been holding the line, but that the Labour Party has built itself in the modern era, not on ordinary working people's interests. It's not the old Labour Party. It's almost entirely a newly formed party based around identity politics, which is made a huge amount of, you know, identity politics when it comes to women, when it comes to gender, when it comes to race. And of course, he now finds that that is problematic, because then there are swathes of people who are in the Labour Party, who are Muslims, who, because that identity politics has been encouraged by the Labour Party, don't identify themselves so much as British Asians, but have been encouraged to see themselves as Muslims, or encouraged to see themselves through the prism of their identity rather than through the prism of their politics. And that means that there's the danger for him of almost civil war in the Labour Party, and that has not been eradicated at all. And you can tell that there's a real nervousness there about what's going to happen. I'm worried beyond just this issue,
yes,
that identity politics is going to be far too big a feature of the Labour Party when it gets into power. Identity politics is what troubles Baroness Claire Fox most, and thank you very much indeed for joining us.